Sir, we can continue. If you would raise your right hand, please. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you give during my conversation with you over the next few minutes will be the truth under penalty of perjury?
I do.
Could you please state your name for the record?
Seth Mazzaglia.
Mr. Mazzaglia, you and I are about to talk about some serious topics. The Supreme Court has called this decision by a defendant a momentous decision. It is that. It's an important decision. Do you feel that you are in a position to understand how important this is and to make this kind of decision today?
I do.
Here are my questions. Have you had an opportunity to discuss in full what your attorney's proposed opening statement is going to be?
Yes.
Has your attorney answered any questions? Don't tell me what they were if you had questions, but has your attorney answered any questions you had about the consequences of making that opening statement?
Yes.
Do you understand that based on what I've heard that your attorney intends, and I'll use the phrase admit, portions of the state's 2 conspiracy charges?
Yes.
Do you understand that whether he does so or not is your decision alone? Whether your attorney has recommended it or not, I don't want to hear about. I just want to know whether you understand that this is your decision, not your attorney's decision.
I do.
Do you in fact authorize your attorney to make that opening statement?
I do.
Particularly, do you in fact authorize your attorney to make what may well constitute admissions to the 2 conspiracy charges?
I do.
Do you understand that by doing so, you may effectively be giving up your right to have the jury decide whether you are guilty of those charges?
Yes.
Do you understand that by doing so, you may effectively be giving up your constitutional right, if you choose, to take the witness stand and proclaim your innocence of those charges?
I do.
Do you understand that by doing so, you may effectively be eliminating the state's burden, which it bears at this point, to prove your guilt of those 2 charges beyond a reasonable doubt?
With regard to those charges, I do.
With regard to those 2 charges, we're talking about the 2 conspiracy charges, sir. Is that your decision, sir?
Yes.
Are you authorizing your attorneys to do that in their opening statement?
I am.
Counsel, I invite proposal for additional questions. If there is anything that either of you feel that I should cover with Mr. Mazzaglia before we proceed to his attorney's opening statement on his behalf.
No, sir. No objection.
Okay. I make a determination, sir, that you have in fact, under State v. Anaya, authorized your attorney to make the opening statement that he has indicated he will be making on your behalf, that it is your decision that he do so, and that thus we can proceed with opening statements. Counsel, Mr. Mazzaglia, you're released from your oath at this point. We've finished our conversation, sir. You can have a seat. Do you need an additional break before the jury comes in, or are we ready for the jury?
I guess we should approach it.
Sure, come right up.
Ladies and gentlemen, Seth Mazzaglia did not rape. He did not murder Ms. Maria. He is not guilty. Kat McDonough caused her death. She did so while sexually dominating her in an intense and prolonged form of breath play. She had a name for it. She called it Queen. On her website that reaches out to the BDSM community, they have a different name for it, but she expressed her interest in doing it to the FedLine, to the BDSM community. She demonstrated to an investigator from my office how it was done. It's a form of breath play where she literally seats herself on the back of her thighs, positioning herself over the woman's face. In this case, it was Liz Marion. In that way, she literally controlled and regulated her breathing. This was enhanced by a BDSM restraint, a harness, that Liz Marion had agreed to put on in discussions with Kat McDonough. And it compounded it because it, in limited ways, restricted her arm movement. And there was a collar which Ms. McDonough described in great detail, and described its effect of limiting one's ability to push forward, to resist. And so, while Kat McDonough engaged in this form of breath play, 10, 15 minutes is what she described. She was lost, and not those moments, but those minutes, by her own desires, but complicated further by the problems that I'll talk about that were going on in her own head. In a time and a place where Miss McDonough didn't have anything to gain and didn't have anything to lose before she turned her story into currency to buy away charges, to buy away years of incarceration. Before that time, she essentially confessed and admitted to these core facts. Okay? Now let me be clear about this, right up front with you. Although Kat caused Lizzie's death, Seth was in fact there. He had engaged over the course of an evening in sexual acts with Kat and with Lizzie. And when Kat's breath play went terribly wrong, because it was not readily perceived in the conditions of the apartment that night in the way Miss McDonough was situated, Seth certainly shared, was overwhelmed by the panic, by the fear, and by the paralysis of judgment, which for him was compounded, was exaggerated by his love, his obsessive love for Kat. And so he did participate in many of those misguided, terribly misguided efforts, the horrible decisions, and the deeply flawed acts that followed the death. And for that, you will likely find him accountable. And he accepts that. But he did not cause Ms. Marriott's death. Kat McDonough did. And for that, she should be held accountable. Now, to understand how it got here, how did this unfold, you need to go back and get some history, get some background. These background issues define the events, the motives, and the claims. So let me start with this. About a year, in fact, less than a year before these events, Seth was living alone in that apartment complex that you saw. He stood outside the door. It's a small one-room apartment. He lived there alone. His dad lived in the building, but he was up there kind of in between. He's a college grad. He's working out at the mall at Best Buy, selling video games. He's certainly probably spending too much time with his buddy Andy playing video games. It's not really where he wanted to be. But he was active. He's an almost compulsive writer of fantasy fiction. He was into gaming, interactive gaming, not just the ones on the console, but things like Dungeons and Dragons involving other people, LARPing, live action, role-playing, where they literally dress up and go out in the woods in groups and pretend to be knights and whatnot. He was very active in that community. He was actively teaching karate to kids in Kittery and very active in local theater. And that's where he met Kat, who was a lead in one of the productions at the time. And they hit it off. What they had in common, though, was the uncommon. They both, from the outside, to most people, would look at them as kind of geeky, nerdy, artistic, but awkward outsiders. To each other, they were creative, artistic, and engaging. They shared a life that in so many respects was defined by fantasy. Their recreation, as I've already touched on, was fantasy-driven. This live-action role-playing, the Dungeons and Dragons, the video games where you interact with 1,000 other people playing the same game, and they took on characters and played in so many elements of their life, thinking about Renaissance fairs, art, theater, and writing. That was fantastical. As I say, to each other, this was engaging. Even their sense of the world around them, they'd talk about in ways that may alienate you folks, a lot of people. Just wouldn't understand it. Tarot cards, spirits, time lapse. It defined their worldview. Indeed, even their sex was, in many ways, defined by fantasy, role-playing. The BDSM that you have heard about, I'm going to get into some more detail about this dominant, submissive, and slave business, but it was role-playing. It was situational fantasy, where they created this by consent between each other, very expressly and very much in control. They were open to others joining them. You will hear about other friends of Kat, about talking about literally going to BDSM conventions, like in Portsmouth, at the Frank Jones Center, being on websites that connected to other people into this. They were open to that. And so this kind of lonely gamer met this engaging, involved, creative, and self-described nymphomaniac, and he was taken by Kat McDonough. She would complain at times that he could not keep up sexually with him. She complained to Roberta Gherkin, a witness you're going to hear on this witness stand. Kat McDonough was very much driving this train, and we'll get into some of those details. There's another element, though, of their fantasy life that you're going to hear about that I want to address now, so it comes to terms as the evidence unfolds, as you hear about it through Kat and others. It's this. I told you that Seth was very much engaged in role-playing fantasies. A lot of those games each other over time about normal day events, but Seth's invoking characters from time past, from the present, from spirit worlds, and they're just talking about things like doing an EMT class, but it's in character. And so when you hear Kat McDonough testify, you're going to be hearing about a lot of different names. It's not just going to be Seth. But here's the thing. While Seth believed this was creative expression with Kat, all of it wasn't for her. For her, it was real, in a weird, dissociated, illogical, irrational way. And it had consequences to this case. So again, from the outside, from the mainstream, you may look at these two and say, you know, they're one part Game of Thrones, one part kinky sex, and one part just normal life, going to work, paying a rent, going grocery shopping. But make no mistake about it, what you're going to hear over the course of the evidence here is that these two perennial outsiders were deeply, deeply connected to each other. And I'm asking you, right up front, not to judge their view most of the conduct, I'm asking you to understand it. See how it shaped and defined actions, events, and things. Okay? So let me start with 5 background issues, very much relevant to this case. For each of these issues, I'm asking you to pay attention to this force on it. Pay attention to Kat McDonough's claims concerning each of these issues before and after. Before she was motivated to buy time outside of prison. Before she was motivated to bargain and sell a story to reduce her charges. And listen to the change, a fundamental change in the nature, substance, and quality of each of these claims as she's confronted with trying to make it. Okay? Let's start with this one. Kat McDonough, when she was in the process of bargaining for time, for freedom, took a witness stand just like this. It may have been this. In front of the grand jury, she took an oath, swearing to tell the truth. And this is one element, one claim she made. You know, I was in an abusive relationship. It was so controlling that's why I did the things that I did that night, because I was controlled by Seth Mazzaglia. And I wouldn't have done it otherwise. It wasn't my own self-interest. I hadn't done anything. It was acquiescing to a relationship that she says controlled. Okay? That's after. Let's talk about before. One of the witnesses is going to be Andy Fowler. She was the high school friend of Kat's that was coming over that night to share her interest in BDSM that she had just discovered herself and turned to Kat. She's a friend who knew her since the beginning of high school. And she describes herself as the type of friend that Kat would come to make disclosures because other friends might judge it, but I wouldn't. So, yeah, she was open with me. When asked about this relationship with Seth, was it controlling? She's like, no. She was, when she got out of her house with her parents, where she hated women, because her father was abusive to her, and took refuge in this apartment at her own design. Andy Fowler says, she looks so happy, so vibrant. She inspired me to find myself. That was the nature of the relationship that Andy Fowler, Kat's good friend, will describe. But hey, that's looking on the outside in, right? Well, why don't we go to the inside, like to Kat McDonough's own words. The state referenced in the opening, hey, there's this like age difference. It's like 29, 19. What about that? Isn't that a factor that you might consider for evaluating and controlling? Well, here's Kat's own words, writing to Seth about this age difference. You know, people are going to question our relationship. It's not, quote, normal. It's not a normal one just because of the age difference. And I know people are going to judge. It makes me so worried. Age doesn't matter to me. I just worry about people making false assumptions because of it. That's before. Now after, he's inviting folks to make false assumptions about it. Age, she wrote, the difference or not, we are meant to be together. And let me tell you, the record of these written exchanges between them, between Seth and Kat, are just replete with Seth acknowledging this age difference and inviting her to even reconsider the relationship with him because it might truncate, foreclose options like moving down to Florida. He said, look, don't rush into this decision to be with me. You're just getting out of high school. You know, the world's your oyster. Don't let this relationship get in the way. He repeated that advice, inviting her to think for herself and to be independent. When she was down and depressed, did he take advantage of it like a controlling person would? No, he wrote to her, look, you're beautiful, you're creative, you're intelligent, you're dynamic, capable, and powerful. He empowered Kat because he loved her. And she took that and she ran. She controlled in isolating her from her friends. That's what she claimed to the grand jury. Oh, I did things because I was afraid. I didn't know where to go. He cut me off from my friends. Here's the before. Seth writing to her when she is leaving home. I'll never mind if you have friends like Tori or Greg, another male friend, Alexa, or anyone else you want. And I do understand if you want just time with them. He did anything but isolate Kat McDonough, despite her sworn testimony to the contrary. In fact, you know, in the context of their relationship, how she identified herself? She used a name. She called herself the Alpha. The Alpha, like a wolf. And he acknowledged it. You are my Alpha. I acknowledge it. He literally had to say it, despite her sworn testimony that much of this is driven by her being controlled. You know what she said when she didn't know anyone was listening? She was being taped. She actually described this phenomenon called the Stockholm Syndrome. You know what that is? It's like when somebody's kidnapped and the victim becomes attached to their kidnapper and actually starts to admire them and follow them because they've been controlled by the kidnapping situation. You know what she said? I'm his Stockholm. If anything, it's him. That's what we're dealing with here. That's the before. Stockholm knows exactly what's going on. And when she takes that witness stand, I'm going to invite you, withhold judgment until you hear some cross-examination. So let's talk about BDS&M. She says, we've heard from the state, BDS&M played the exact same role of defining this relationship as controlled, where she was submissive and he was dominant all the time. And so that night, she's like this slave, just following every word and whim, right? Just like the last one, it's the opposite. First, Seth didn't introduce her to BDS&M. She came that way. She's on record acknowledging that her interests are years long, that she spent time online, researching, developing an interest in this, and I'm a switch. I can play either role. Good at either. But her interest that she really wanted to develop was to dominate and dominate women. In fact, even with Seth, she did what's called topping from the bottom. So did you hear? What does that mean? It means she's literally so much in control that she tells him how she wants to be dominated. In other words, the dom doesn't just come in and dominate Kat McDonough. She tells them first how it's going to be done. It's called topping from the bottom. So, did you see on this screen, the state put on that letter to her when she was at camp? And it was this terrible stuff about when you come home, X, Y, and Z is going to happen to you, and your other option is to bring a friend. What? She was so much in control that she defined what Seth was supposed to fantasize about. You know how this worked? You know how this worked? She had a Post-it program on her computer. And she's on record saying this. I'm not. She says, when I had a fantasy of how I wanted to be dominated, I'd write it out on a Post-it note so that he could see it and follow my instructions about how to be dominated. Do you know this? Virtually every one of those kind of perverse, at least in the context of a courtroom, strained, domineering statements that were embedded in that thing? She wrote to him. Here they are. These were discovered. Kat acknowledged being the author of this. Now, it's going to be graphic. That was graphic, right? I want to be fucked like a sex slave in front of another person. Hold it. But Seth Mazzaglia was supposed to be driving this about bringing in another woman, about somebody else. Nope. It's Kat. She wrote it to him. He just took everything she wrote and put it in that letter for her. I want to fuck a slave. Me on top of her. Her with a strap on, her hands on my chest, my hands tied above my head. These were her fantasies. I want to be tied down to the bed with you fucking me, using my body as you please. These were her words, all before that letter, instructing him. He just plagiarized, literally. I want to be trained by you. The name calling in that letter, she had told him, you know, I came up with these names with one of my friends. And now she's turning the table and saying, God, how perverse, how controlling. But you're the judges, okay? Pay attention to who's driving this and when the claims change. Remember that letter? Sounded so threatening and dire. Do you want to know what he wrote to Seth? I almost cried when I got home from camp because I was so happy. Because they played out some of this stuff as she directed. Sexual domination, she is all over the record of dominating Seth on a regular basis. You want to know how? Tying him down. Restraining him with rope. That's how it started. She even complained and admitted this to investigators. You know, I was into the rope. He really wasn't that much. She would go online and research it. She actually put these harnesses on herself. And so this informs what happened that night. Because here's the question. Why would she lie about being controlled? And why would she lie about never dominating anybody? That's what she swore to the grand jury. I never engaged in dominating sexual activity. Why? It's too close to the truth. The record is so replete with Kat McDonough dominating Seth Mazzaglia and her desires to dominate, not Seth, but another woman. So let's talk about this. Her claim to the grand jury, again, under oath, at a time when she was creating currency, was this. I wasn't interested in other women coming to the house. It was all Seth, and I thought it was crazy. I wanted it to stop. But here's the evidence. She would literally disclose to them. You know, one of the issues is she's bisexual, right? And so she was confronted with this basic issue. He couldn't satisfy her in that way. So she was very much open to and wanting women to come into her sexual life. And that's one big element of how we got here. It's true they were both interested in polyamorous relationships. Seth was open to having another woman. But look at the ads. She makes an ad for another woman on her own. Seth actually makes an ad that is also for Kat. She claimed that these websites were for him. But here's the evidence. When Seth was out of the picture after his arrest, she continued to look. She disclosed this. Seth, remember when I told you I needed someone else? She's talking about a woman. I couldn't go to some of these friends, Nikki or Andy. I need her. I need her. She's talking about another woman she's seen. at least until we get me my dark-haired lady. Remember that. Kat McDonough had an ideal of who she was going to bring into her life sexually. And unfortunately, Liz Marriott fit that bill. It's interesting that when they actually did, on very limited occasions, had sexual encounters with other people, with two other women, they all involved the other women having sex with Kat, not Seth. The very next night, I am talking about after Liz Marriott dies underneath her, Kat McDonough continues, persists to look for another woman. She's on record. She discloses this to a friend. She calls this another woman. She gives her a name, Edja. She discloses to Roberta on tape. She doesn't know she's being taped. You know the worst fucking thing is? Not that Liz Marriott died. You know what the worst thing is? Could have had Edja. The problem died. That's sick. But it reveals the level of obsession of Kat McDonough's drive to look for and bring in another woman to dominate. Even as he's in jail, she discloses to him in telephone calls, boy, I think I saw somebody at Michael's. You know what she finally says? Like an epiphany, 6 months too late. I think I'm over the addiction. Seth asked, what addiction? You know, it's the fun. The fun. What fun? Other girls. Looking for other girls. It was an addiction that she struggled with and unfortunately embraced for a period of time, and it led to these events. Other personalities. She took an oath to the grand jury when she was in her bargaining phase and said, you know, the only explanation for Seth coming in and just murdering her while we're watching a movie is he's got another personality. It's called Doomsday. All right, well, here's the evidence. The evidence is going to be that there are all kinds of fictitious characters that he used in fiction, okay? Fiction. There's even a scorecard with Doomsday's name next to it. It was a play character. They joked about Doomsday between them, but in front of the grand jury, she tries to sell it as some homicidal maniac character within Seth Mazzaglia. We're going to talk about that on cross-examination when she is on record joking with Doomsday. It's nonsense. But here's something that is not. That is very serious and dangerous. And it's this. They weren't games because we know this. She disclosed them to other people before even meeting Seth. She disclosed it to a teacher who she said, help me learn how to deal with the voices in my head. She gave them names. Violet, Anae, Charlotte, James, her unborn son. And she struggled with it. She actually described how they caused her to be uncertain about things like, well, the truth. She said it caused her to lie. She actually had arguments at work that she described. Here's one. She's telling Seth after work, I had an argument in my head. No one else knew. No one noticed, though, so it was okay. Seth asked, who? Well, all four ladies. Violet started. No, actually, it was based off Scar's ridiculous lifestyle. Vi annoyed her. Stupid fucking kitty. Had to open her mouth when it wasn't even her fucking problem. She's having arguments in her head with her voices. But here's where it gets terribly relevant in this case. One of those personalities named Charlotte. And she describes Charlotte taking over her body when she does not want to, that she struggles for control, and she blacks out when she loses control to Charlotte. Why is that relevant? Here's one of the little pieces of truth that slipped out while Kat McDonough was didn't get arrested, wasn't bargaining, met with Roberta. Roberta's got the mic, Kat doesn't know it, and the truth slips out. We know that night she was being lied to by one of her voices. There was a struggle. And so literally, when she is engaged in this act with Liz Marriott, she's not all there. And it plays into her incapacity to be aware, to be attentive, to be connected to that moment enough to be the guardian of Liz Marriott's safety while they are engaging in risky activity. But she doesn't reveal that. She doesn't say anything about that to the grand jury. Why? Because that, too, is just too close to the truth. Okay, so now, what happened? Well, Kat McDonough invites Liz Marriott over, sees her at work, exchanges the fact that she is bisexual too, exchanges the fact that she is into BDSM, Kat is, and they set up a night over at the apartment. And it's true, nothing happens there. But you'd think if Seth was driving this train about getting other women to come over, wouldn't he be lurking about? No, it's not even there. He's at work. Comes home in the few minutes left before Miss Marriott leaves. And then Kat, because she is taken by Liz Marriott, invites her over on the night. What's the plan that night? Kat's other friends are coming over by 10:30. They expect Liz Marriott to leave. There's no diabolical plan to rape and murder. They're literally expecting her to be there for less than an hour. Okay? And yet, what happens is those friends cancel, but not for approximately an hour. So, in the preceding hour, things are driven by Kat. She even says, you know, I feel things out. I just sort of throw things out there jokingly, but I pull a few strings. And here's what she did. She said, hey, you know, we can do all kinds of stuff. We can talk about Dungeons and Dragons or not, or maybe go search for ghosts, but we could also play strip poker. And Liz Marriott was game for it. And very quickly, within 20 minutes, everybody's clothes are up. But during that time, Kat McDonough is introducing the subject of the BDSM. She brings out her box, which she made, containing restraints and BDSM toys. And she puts one on herself. In fact, there's now a threesome, the type of threesome, a version of it that they've done before that has nothing to do with Seth and another woman. And they, in fact, have a sexual encounter. It ends. Seth believes the night is over. The friends were supposed to come, but now they have an open night. He literally goes into the bathroom and texts Kat, hey, are we painting tonight? Does that sound weird? Well, the fact is, they were painting her mother's, Seth's mother's apartment because they were going to move in there that spring. The tarp was on the counter, ready to go. They kept very weird hours, anywhere from midnight to 5 in the morning. So the notion of going painting at 10:30 is not unusual for these guys. But that was Seth's expectation. Kat texts back, I don't know, I guess. If you have a plan, I'm nervous. And here's what she was nervous about, is that after their encounter, she's already starting to talk to Liz Marriott about putting on a harness. She was open to it. And that is, in fact, what unfolded. And what unfolded are the sexual acts that I described at the very outset, involving graphic. And it went terribly wrong. And Seth didn't cause it. What then did happen next was sheer panic. Seth said, call Roberta. Get him over here. Bad move? Bad move. But then he goes into protection mode. Kat goes into self-preservation mode. She texts Liz Marriott, listen to the quality of this Hey, darling. She just died. She has the capacity to. Hey, darling. Expected you at 10. Where are you? You coming? Chillingly effective and casual control. Seth is in a panic. And when Roberta and Paul get over, their impression is that Seth is going to call. But before they leave, they hear Kat beginning to contrive a story. Kat beginning to contrive a story about, hey, you know, she had a long walk between her dorm and her car. That's not something they worked out together. Roberta and Paul literally witnessed Kat beginning to contrive this. And that's what she went with. Police, subsequently, a long interview with New Hampshire State Police, that's what she went with. Not Seth forcing her to do this. But you want to know what happened? So there is a shameful process that unfolds where they destroy evidence. Kat McDonough gets a bag and stuffs her things, these various things. Kat McDonough goes through the purse and finds the key. Kat McDonough pulls out her suitcase. She's the one who thought of it. Kat McDonough puts tape around the suitcase. These are not acquiescing to Seth. She is in self-preservation mode because she is culpable and accountable. Kat McDonough gets in the car and drives because Seth is so unhinged and undone. Kat McDonough takes a left out of her parking lot. You know why her statement was about that? You know, I mean, you saw the highway was up to your right, of course. She said, you know, I want to take a back road because I just didn't want to affect my commute with bad memory like this. So I didn't take the highway. That's sick. And Kat McDonough pulls over at the Portsmouth Hospital area and says, geez, I remember my brother used to be able to track me with the GPS. We got to destroy this. She's thinking about self-preservation. Kat McDonough thinks going to the island. Kat McDonough drives to the island and finds the path that Seth wasn't aware of, didn't know. And Kat McDonough becomes exasperated when Seth's resolve begins to fade. And she said, God, complained about being tired. It's Kat McDonough who drove us on up to the lookout, and together they pushed the body over the rail. But you saw that incline. Persistence to climb down, all the way down. There's only one person that Kat McDonough. Kat McDonough got down to the bottom. She covered the body in seaweed and pushed it into the water and made a glib, chilling statement about welcome to Davy Jones's locker. But what happens? Eventually, they both are separated in a police department, and Kat goes with a very detailed story about hunting ghosts, able to talk just as a lie. And so when you're up there, and she's up there, and you're evaluating her, keep this in mind. You're looking at her with a lie. She talks about the details of how the sun broke through, the moon broke through, and I couldn't quite adjust my camera, but no, Kat McDonough never showed up. Lizzie Marriott never showed up. She's able to lie to the state police in unbelievable detail. But Seth, he was upstairs in an interview with a different officer, wrote out a map, got in a car, led him to that location, and what he did next was a reflection of how much he had been taken by Kat McDonough, because he described to them taking the blame for the drug play that he was not engaged in. It leaked out. It spilled out. Well, what if I'm just doing this to put myself in the crosshairs like somebody else? He said, well, what if I just said this? Kat McDonough. What's the time, Judge? How much time?
20 minutes almost.
Cat McDonough then begins to unravel. The situation unravels. They arrest Seth. He's in jail. And I told you, she continues incredibly to look for other women. Report it to him at the jail. She was on her own twisted mission, without remorse, compelled by what she describes as an addiction. They're running scared? Yeah, absolutely. You know, she comes literally to my office, and just a couple of days after Seth's arrested, and gives the statement that in some, I told you, that she described this thing. But it was in a time and place where we didn't have anything to offer her. She didn't have anything to gain. But she certainly came to regret it. Because she makes the claim when she finally is in front of a grand jury, we fed her the information. There's some problems with that. You're going to hear from the investigator in my office. We didn't know the information. So we'll have some discussions about her claims about our conduct, violating protocol and the law. Objection. Approaching.
Counsel, thank you. Attorney Barth, you can pick it up wherever you'd like.
I'll pick it up where we were, which was there was an investigator in my office witnessing this exchange. She wrote notes. Ms. McDonough came back with a tape actually corrected, minor corrections in the statement that she gave to us. Oh yeah, signed it. And so her claims to the grand jury that we somehow led her down a path that we did not yet know existed will be something for you folks to evaluate about Kat's credibility on that point. Because, I told you, she made this statement days later, nothing to gain and nothing to lose. She regrets it. So, she's saying we did something unlawful in order to get it. What happens next? She is out on the street, and there's a lot going on. She is afraid that Seth will turn. On one of those one parties, she actually says to Roberta, I wouldn't be if he was talking. I wouldn't be out here. Like, nobody's planning on doing it. He's planning on putting it all on himself. She discloses that on this one point. Whew. Well, in order to shut him up, in her mind, she literally goes down to the jail one day, and this is on record. She's the one who proposes to him. He's like, huh? What's she thinking? I'm going to lock him down with this bogus notion of the law. That happens to be not true, but she's the one thinking, well, he'll never even be able to testify against him. It was her proposal to him. Okay? So that's one issue that goes on during this intern time, this weird time where she hasn't been in front of a grand jury yet and he's incarcerated. What's the other thing that happens? These letters. One of them was they claim that he's trying to get rid of her suicide letter. And you got to read this letter. It is literally Seth as a guy incarcerated with literally this is her term, nymphomaniac girlfriend, writing to her about sexual fantasies, because that's the type of thing that turns her on. And so the suicide letter, you got to read the details of this thing. It literally talks about, here's this sort of a ritualistic way to commit suicide. Before you do it, in order to ensure that we end up in Sovngarde, a mythical heaven, you need to go out and commit, and then it's this like penthouse forum version of sex acts that are just silly, graphic, but it's nonsense. And when you read it, you know what I'm talking about. So we'll go over it with Cat McDonough. And if anybody could seriously consider that an urge to commit suicide, we'll reconsider the notion. It'll be for you to decide. Next, these letters about escape. Seth was receiving letters from Cat, invoking these just fantasy notions about just moving on, about going and living in a cottage in the woods, about a Renaissance fair, a Renaissance bed and breakfast that they built. In other words, she was telling him, come and we will go and live in this fantasy thing, you know? And she said to him, that's all I have to hold on to. And so he wrote these ridiculous notes and letters about moving forward. What about the letter that said, memorize this version of events, and then destroy it, and throw Paul under the bus? There's no doubt he was kind of spinning out of control, because he did not want, even sitting in jail, Kat to go forward with the statement that she provided to us. She was saying, the voices in my head are taking away my memories. That's on tape. The voices in my head are taking away my memory. So he wrote out this version. You can see, you can kind of confirm this, that he's telling her to memorize things that aren't even in dispute, like the strip poker, reminding her of this because she's invoked the voices in her head taking away her memory. That's what those letters. So then things really implode. She is told by Roberta, who's become a state agent, she's acting on behalf of the police. She wears a wire. She meets with Kat. Kat doesn't know she's wired. And in order to try and get Kat to talk, they tell her a lie. They say, Kat, Seth's rolled on. He's blaming you. It's a total lie. Do you think that's designed to generate a reliable response from someone like Kat? Well, it doesn't. It says, she's literally on a tape saying this, well, I'm going to go bargain, which means I'm going to go sell my story. That's how we got here. They lie to Kat that Seth is turning on her and blaming her, which is not happening. And she gets to the front of the grand jury by agreement, provided immunity, and given this claim. Kat came over, Ms. McDonough came over that night. We did play strip. We have another expert coming up from Connecticut, the medical examiner. Is going to interpret the observations of witnesses that that's not strangulation by ligature. We'll get to that. But what she then says happens next is, I don't know, I did whatever he said. I mean, I thought he was going to kill me, so I went along with all this stuff. That's the basic claim. Okay? One thing I'm going to ask you to consider in putting together these competing narratives. It's a couple issues. Let's see if we can get to the forensic stuff, but this. She's pretty precise in her grand jury testimony about certain things. One is that strip poker starts almost immediately after we get there. Here's the thing. We know two things where you really don't have to do a credibility determination, because we've got this hard, immutable evidence of when a telephone call was made or a text was made. So we know the time frame is about 2 hours from when Miss Marriott arrived, because of her text message, hey, I'm outside. And we know in fairly close proximity to when she must have died because of the call to Roberta, right? That defines our minute. Here's the thing. Look at her statement to you, her claim to you about what happened. We played poker. How long? It's only about 20 minutes. That's how, a strip poker hand, both people who lose take off their clothes. It doesn't last that long. 20 minutes. Well, then what happened? We started watching a movie, and next thing I know, Seth's strangling her to death. No words spoken before, no threats, nothing. Just start strangling her to death. How long did we watch the movie? 10, 15 minutes. How long did it take to strangle her? 10 minutes. We've got a problem here. If you add that up, most are talking 45 minutes. What happened to the other hour? Where'd it go? The hour didn't go anywhere. It's what happened during it. You want to know? When we asked her, hey, how long did those sexual acts take in totality? Answer? About an hour. So you want to piece together through some common sense what happened here. Take a close look at the details as you work through the evidence. All right? This is there. I told you the forensic evidence will be competing. It is still, even when experts come in, even when doctors come in, it is still your role to make a determination of fact. I'll tell you, the description that the cat is a ligature strangulation from behind, where she literally describes putting his full force and bracing himself and choking her. And yet there's no what is called a ligature furrow. Dr. Camper from Connecticut is going to say, that's going to leave a furrow. The puffiness in the face, he says, is a result of it's one cause of death of smothering, or you can have an asymmetrical cardiac arrest where one side of the heart is still pumping. It causes congestion in the face and that profound blueness. But the literature that he looks to in his experience is if you put that kind of force with a ligature, and it's not some towel or something soft, it will leave a pronounced furrow that nobody sees. Not the cat, not Roberta, not Paul. What is described by witnesses is consistent with a cause of death resulting from smothering, from the type of smothering related to the very unsettled and ultimately fatal breath play that Mazzaglia engaged in. Cat McDonough is going to be the only witness in here who has entered into an agreement to provide you testimony in exchange for something. Everybody else just comes in here and says, I'm going to tell you the truth. But Cat McDonough cannot change. If she does, there will be consequences. Prison and potentially more charges. So let me be upfront. They're not going to be a Perry Mason moment in this case where she comes in here and says, you got me, you're right, because she's got too much to lose. But ladies and gentlemen, that's why you're here. It is easy in this case to provoke, to raise sympathies. Sympathies for Liz Marriott. Saw her picture, her beautiful picture. And it would be easy to provoke sympathy for her, her family, and anger about the circumstances of her body not being found. But we're here to honor the principles that we talked about, each one of us, in jury selection. The principles that this country defends and defines, providing a fair trial, presuming innocence, following the law and procedure, and that means an active engagement at this point. And you folks are challenging, scrutinizing the evidence and the inferences. And if you do that, we will come back at the end of this case and ask you to apply your collective common sense and your good judgment to find Mazzaglia not guilty.
Thank you, Attorney Barth. Jurors, I remind you, as I said I would at this point, that what you've heard in opening statements by the attorneys, anything read or shown to you concerning what the evidence might be, is not evidence. You'll have additional evidence in this case only when the first witness is sworn on the witness stand after the lunch break. We will take the lunch break at this point. It's a couple of minutes past noon. We'll break until a couple of minutes past 1, a full hour for lunch. Counsel, if you would stay a moment, we'll talk about the schedule. Jurors, enjoy your lunch break.
All right.
be seated.
Council, as to the schedule, picking it back up at 1. Picking it back up at 1 works. You'll be ready with your first witness. 1 o'clock start works for you. You'll be ready with your first witness at 1.
I have a motion first.
You have a motion?
Moving for mistrial.
All right. Let me do this. Let me take a moment myself to take a break. I'll come back and hear from you on that, hear from you in response. Attorney Barth, anything to raise before we take a break? No. All right. Probably no more than 2 or 3 minutes.
All right. All rise to the honorable court. Please be seated.
All right, welcome back. We remain on the record outside the presence of the jury. Attorney Hinckley, I understand the state has a motion.
Yes, also, Judge, it was something we brought up at the bench beforehand about a more particular Anaya colloquy.
Yes, as well, but your motion is for a mistrial, which if I grant would render that moot. Go ahead.
With respect to the state's motion for mistrial, the state had filed a motion, I believe, last week to preclude, actually it wasn't last week, it was quite some time, to preclude the defense from making any remarks about statements that the defendant made during the course of a lengthy interview with investigators. The court made a ruling on that about counsel's good faith basis to make assertions in front of the jury. He did make those assertions in front of the jury, and I was taking notes when he did. And what he told the jury was that Seth was upstairs. He wrote out for investigators a map. He led them to that location, and what he did next, he took blame for breath play. That is not what happened during the course of the interview. There were 7 hours in between when he showed them where he dumped the body to when he, and again we take issue with this, taking blame for Lizzie Marriott's death, in which he gave several different accounts of what happened and tried to shift blame to other people. The state's belief that there's not a good faith basis for that statement, that highly prejudices the state's case as was set forth in the motion that the state filed last week, and that as a result of that, nothing can be cured with an instruction because the bell has already been unrung, which is something the state rose as an issue to the court before. So the state believes that a motion for a mistrial is appropriate under these circumstances. The state also, pursuant to the court's order, the state also believes that the defendant or defense counsel, through the statements that he made to the jurors, has blown open the door to otherwise inadmissible evidence based on the suppression ruling. Since again, he again said that his client took investigators to a location, and what he did next was the quote that counsel gave to the jurors. He took blame for breath play. That is not what happened during the course of the interview. It is misleading. It prejudiced the state, and the state asked for mistrial.
Attorney Barth. Attorney Barth, whenever you're ready.
We object to a mistrial. I believe that the standard, although there's a recent case that does acknowledge the state's ability to invoke and to request a mistrial over the defense objection, first I want to make it clear that we object. The standard, as I believe, is manifest necessity, and that the state has a burden over the defendant's objection to show irreparable harm in some aspect of their case. In some, the state is saying that the reference to statements in a 10, 11-hour interview weren't accurate because they didn't encompass the 10 or 11 hours. There's nothing about opening statements that requires me to provide the totality of a statement going the course of 11 hours, or even a single written one-page document. The issue about what happens next is we go to trial, and we resolve inferences or evidentiary issues that are in dispute through witnesses. The state has provided you with a conclusory statement that it is inaccurate, that he's taken accountability for causing death through breath play. I guess I'll state the conclusory statement. No, he didn't. I'm not, without any factual, contextual basis to respond to, I can't provide you with much more of an argument than that.
I'll be right back to you. Attorney Hinckley, anything further on your motion?
It's not that counsel didn't go through the totality of the statement that his client gave. It's the fact, again, and I quoted this, according to Attorney Barth in his opening to the jurors, his client wrote out a map for investigators, led them to that location, and what he did next was taking blame for breath play. That's an acceptance of blame that did not happen. It's inaccurate and it misrepresents to the prejudice of the state's case.
Take your time, Attorney Barth. Whenever you're ready, if there's anything further, I'll hear from you.
I guess we could get fairly specific. The state is indicating that did not place blame for causing death through breath play. I'm looking at 428 of the transcript. You know what? I'm not quite sure how to respond without a specific account of how it is. Of being, you know, they simply provided you with a conclusion. It didn't happen that way.
Attorney Hinckley, anything further? And to be clear, I'm not sending you in any particular direction. I'm simply listening to argument. Go ahead.
He cited a page, transcript 428. That's well beyond what the court, another court, stated that the state is suppressed from referencing to. It's also several hundred pages after the defendant took investigators to the location where he dumped Lizzie Marriott's body. And in those couple of hundred pages in between those two events, which encompass about 4 or 5 hours, the defendant gave various versions of events in which he did not accept blame and he, in fact, tried to shift blame to Kat McDonough and to others. That was what we alerted the court and counsel to before, and that's exactly what counsel misrepresented to these jurors in the opening statement.
Last word, Attorney Barth, to you if there's anything further to be said.
I disagree.
Should be obvious. I'll state it. So nonetheless obvious. I'm going to leave the bench, think about this for a few minutes, and come back and tell you where I come out. If I'm going to be more than a few minutes, in fairness, I'll pass word to you through the bailiffs that I'm delayed, but I don't expect I'll be more than a few minutes.
All right.